Bay of Biscay, July 1944, 14:37 hours. The submarine stayed on the surface. Earlier in the war, the moment an aircraft appeared, the order would have been immediate. Crash dive. But by 1944, that instinct had changed. Too many German submarines had been caught halfway through emergency dives, slow, exposed, and unable to escape bombs falling from the sky. Allied aircraft had learned to attack aggressively, and diving no longer guaranteed survival. So German crews adapted. Instead of diving immediately, many U-boats began fighting back. When the lookouts spotted the aircraft approaching low over the Atlantic, the alarm rang across the deck. Aircraft port side. The captain stepped onto the bridge and made his decision instantly. Flak positions, hold the surface. Crewmen rushed across the narrow steel deck, throwing open protective covers on the submarine's anti-aircraft guns. Within seconds, the twin flak mounts were swinging toward the approaching bomber. Diesel engines roared as the submarine increased speed, trying to make itself a harder target. Above the water, the aircraft descended steadily. The patrol bomber had already seen the submarine from several kilometers away. In the Bay of Biscay, Allied aircraft expected submarines to fight back. Many carried heavier weapons, now rockets, bombs, and reinforced armor around vulnerable areas. The pilot kept the nose down. From his cockpit window, the gray hull of the submarine grew larger every second. The navigator spoke calmly behind him. Submarine confirmed, guns manned. Below, the U-boat's anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Bright tracer rounds streaked upward in rapid bursts, arcing toward the approaching bomber. The gun crews worked quickly, adjusting their aim as the aircraft closed distance. The first tracers passed beneath the bomber. The next burst came closer. Inside the cockpit, the pilot saw the flashes clearly. But he did not turn away. To hit a submarine, the attack had to be fast and close. Bombs dropped too early would explode harmlessly behind the target. That meant flying directly through the gunfire. The bomber continued descending. 300 meters. 200. Now the tracers were streaking past the aircraft's wings. Fragments of exploding flak snapped through the air around the bomber's fuselage. Inside the aircraft, the bombardier crouched over the release controls. Stand by. The submarine's guns were firing continuously now. But the bomber did not climb. It came straight in. Because in anti-submarine warfare, the attack that succeeds is often the one that refuses to break away. And the bomber was now only seconds from the release point. The bomber did not flinch. Tracer rounds were now passing close enough for the crew to see them streak past the cockpit windows, bright orange lines cutting upward through the gray sky. Inside the aircraft, the bombardier kept his eyes fixed on the submarine rushing toward them. Release in 3, 2, 1. The bombs dropped. From the U-boat's deck, the crew saw the dark shapes fall almost directly overhead. There was no time left to dive. A crash dive required precious seconds, hatches sealed, ballast tanks flooded, the hull slowly sliding beneath the surface. Those seconds were gone. The captain shouted the order anyway. Dive, dive. But the submarine had barely begun to slow when the bombs struck the water. The first explosion erupted alongside the hull, throwing a massive column of seawater across the deck. Men at the anti-aircraft guns were knocked off balance as the blast wave slammed into the submarine. Then the second detonation came even closer. The entire boat shuddered violently. Inside the control room, lights flickered and instruments rattled across metal panels. The pressure wave rolled through the hull like a thunderclap trapped underwater. Above them, the bomber roared past the submarine at barely 50 meters altitude. The pilot pulled the aircraft upward sharply, escaping the worst of the anti-aircraft fire as the explosions erupted behind him. From the cockpit, the crew looked back. The ocean, where the submarine had been seconds earlier, was now a violent churn of foam and smoke. Water surged across the deck as the submarine struggled to complete its dive. The stern began slipping beneath the surface while crewmen scrambled to seal the final hatch. But the attack had landed at the worst possible moment, when the submarine was still mostly exposed. The shockwaves rolled through the hull again. A third detonation exploded directly astern. The submarine lurched downward as water rushed across the deck, and for a moment it seemed the entire vessel might break apart under the force. Inside the aircraft, the navigator watched carefully. "Direct pattern," he said quietly. The bomber continued climbing into the cloud layer. Below, the Atlantic slowly swallowed the submarine. But the attack had been delivered at point-blank range. And in the Bay of Biscay in 1944, that kind of attack rarely left a submarine untouched. The submarine finally slipped beneath the water. But the dive had come too late. Inside the hull, the shock of the explosions had already done their damage. The pressure waves from the bombs rolled through the submarine's steel frame as the boat descended deeper into the Atlantic. In the control room, the lights flickered again as the submarine passed 20 meters. "Report," the captain shouted. A petty officer stumbled forward from the forward compartment. "Minor flooding forward section, pipe rupture." Another crewman shouted from the engine space. "Port diesel damaged." But at that moment, the commander's priority was survival. "Continue the dive." Ballast tanks filled as the submarine angled downward. The boat creaked under the pressure as the depth gauge climbed, 30 meters, 40, 50. Above them, the water still churned violently from the bomb explosions. Inside the patrol bomber, the crew circled once more. The pilot banked the aircraft low enough for the observer to scan the surface carefully. If the bombs had ruptured the submarine's hull, the ocean would soon reveal the result. Oil slicks, floating debris, or a trail of bubbles rising from below. But the water showed none of those signs yet. Instead, the surface slowly calmed. "Possible escape," the navigator muttered. Below the waves, the submarine continued descending. The crew worked quickly to contain the damage. A repair team sealed the broken pipe, while another crewman checked the electrical systems that had been shaken loose by the blast. Despite the violent attack, the hull itself remained intact. That alone meant the submarine still had a chance. But the crew understood something clearly now. They had stayed on the surface too long. By the time the bomber had arrived overhead, diving had no longer been an option. Above them, the aircraft completed one final circle. Then the pilot turned the bomber toward the distant coastline of Britain. Fuel and patrol routes demanded that he continue the mission elsewhere. Inside the submarine, the crew waited several tense minutes before speaking again. The commander finally looked at the depth gauge. "Hold at 60 meters. For now, the boat had survived. But the Atlantic had just proven something brutally clear. Fighting aircraft on the surface was a gamble. And sometimes the sky attacked faster than a submarine could disappear. The submarine held steady at 60 meters. Inside the control room, the red emergency lights cast long shadows across the steel bulkheads. The violent shock of the bombs had knocked instruments loose and scattered tools across the floor, but the boat was still moving. That meant the hull had survived. For the crew, the next battle was inside the submarine. "Damage report," the commander ordered. The forward compartment petty officer stepped forward. "Pipe rupture contained, minor flooding stopped." Another sailor reported from the engine section. Port diesel disabled from shock damage. Starboard engine operational once surfaced. The commander nodded slowly. The attack had come dangerously close, but the bombs had exploded just far enough away to spare the submarine from catastrophic hull damage. That distance, sometimes only a few meters, often decided whether a submarine survived or vanished instantly beneath the sea. Still, the commander understood how narrow the escape had been. The submarine had stayed on the surface to fight, and for a few moments, the anti-aircraft guns had seemed effective. Tracer fire had forced the bomber to fly through a curtain of flak before reaching its release point. But aircraft attacks happened too quickly. A bomber closing at high speed could cover the final distance in seconds. By the time the submarine began its crash dive, the bombs had already been falling. The commander studied the depth gauge again. Maintain 60 meters, silent running. The hydrophone operator adjusted his headphones, listening carefully for the faintest sound of aircraft engines. After several seconds, he shook his head. No contact. Above them, the Atlantic had grown quiet again. The patrol bomber was gone. But the commander did not allow the submarine to surface yet. Aircraft patrols in the Bay of Biscay were frequent. Another bomber could appear without warning, and surfacing too early could place the submarine directly beneath another attack. So the boat remained submerged. Inside the submarine, the crew continued repairing damaged systems while the commander waited. Waiting had become a central skill in submarine warfare. Because the moment a submarine surfaced again, the sky might already be watching. For nearly 20 minutes, the submarine did nothing. The electric motors ran at the lowest possible speed, barely pushing the boat forward through the dark water. Every unnecessary sound was avoided. Even the crew moved carefully across the deck plates. Silent running had become instinct. The hydrophone operator listened continuously. No aircraft engines. No distant propellers. Just the steady rhythm of water flowing along the hull. Above the submarine, the Bay of Biscay had returned to its usual calm appearance. The explosions from the bombs had already faded into widening ripples across the surface. The patrol bomber had disappeared toward the horizon. But the commander refused to surface yet. Aircraft patrols often overlapped. Another bomber could easily arrive while the submarine was still recovering from the first attack. Only after the hydrophone operator confirmed complete silence for several minutes did the commander finally nod. Prepare to surface. Compressed air rushed into the ballast tanks. Slowly, the submarine began rising through the water column. Inside the boat, the crew watched the depth gauge climb steadily. 50 meters. 40. 30. At periscope depth, the commander raised the narrow optical tube above the surface and scanned the sky carefully. The horizon appeared empty. No aircraft. No ships. Only gray Atlantic water stretching in every direction. After another long look, the commander lowered the periscope. Surface. Moments later, the submarine broke through the water once again. Fresh air rushed into the hull as the hatch opened. But the calm surface no longer felt safe. Earlier in the war, submarines had often relied on their anti-aircraft guns for protection. Surfacing to fight aircraft sometimes forced pilots to break off attacks before reaching effective range. But by 1944, Allied aircraft crews had adapted. They flew lower. They attacked faster. And they were trained to push directly through anti-aircraft fire if necessary. The bomber that had attacked this submarine had done exactly that. Instead of climbing away from the flak guns, it had continued its approach until the bombs could be dropped almost directly beside the hull. That kind of attack left submarines very little time to dive. By the later years of the war, the balance between submarines and aircraft had shifted dramatically. Allied patrol bombers now carried radar capable of detecting surface submarines far beyond visual range. Long-range aircraft could patrol areas like the Bay of Biscay continuously. For German submarines leaving or returning to their bases, the sky had become one of the most dangerous parts of the journey. A submarine might evade destroyers for days beneath the water, but a single aircraft sighting could trigger an attack within seconds. The commander of the submarine thought about the moment the lookout had shouted. They had chosen to fight. Anti-aircraft guns blazing. For a few seconds, it had seemed like the right decision. But aircraft moved faster than submarines. The bomber had reached release range before the submarine could disappear beneath the waves. Only luck and a few meters of distance had allowed the boat to survive. The patrol bomber flew straight through the anti-aircraft fire. That was the moment the battle was decided. Earlier in the war, many aircraft would have broken away once tracer rounds began climbing toward them. The risk of flying directly over a submarine's guns had been considered too great. But by 1944, Allied pilots had learned something important. The closer they flew, the more accurate their attacks became. And accuracy could destroy a submarine before it had time to dive. The bomber that afternoon refused to turn away. It flew through the flak, released its bombs at point-blank range, and escaped before the submarine disappeared beneath the surface. The submarine survived, but the lesson remained. In the later years of the Atlantic War, submarines no longer controlled the battlefield alone. Because now the sky was willing to attack, even when the guns were firing back.